Hello, and welcome to our webinar. Today is a dive into sea turtle research planning in support of impact assessment for U.S. Atlantic offshore wind. This webinar is brought to you by Barco's Ocean Conservation Work Group. My name is Kevin Hassel. I'm with New Jersey's Department of Environmental Protection. I'm currently the state lead for the Offshore Ocean Conservation Work Group, which is made up of states, federal agencies, and NGO partners. Real quick, we'll run through some Zoom logistics. We're recording this webinar. We'll post it afterwards, so everyone's aware. Since we have a lot of folks joining this webinar, everyone is muted as you came in, and you will not be able to unmute. So please enter your questions, comments, and ocean-related puns into the chat. We'll be looking through the chat to supply those during the question and answer session later. I note that we'll also be supplying a link in the chat at the end of the webinar to help understand what topics you'd like to hear more about. So we established this work group to build on the work happening in the region and to develop a comprehensive understanding of how conservation efforts intersect with changing oceanographic conditions, such as climate change, shift in species distributions, and new uses such as aquaculture and wind energy. Today, we'll be hearing about sea turtle research planning and what we know and don't know about these turtly awesome species. There are lots of data gaps, and collection of information can be challenging, so we'll be hearing some highlights from the Sea Turtle chapter of the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative for Offshore Wind Science Plan on how we might address some of these concerns for these important species. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Susan Barco, protected marine species expert, who will be giving our presentation, and also Jay Adele, Urban Coast Institute's Fisheries and Ocean Conservation Fellow, and also a work group member, who will be facilitating our question and answer portion of the webinar. So Sue has over 30 years of experience at the Virginia Aquarium and Marine Science Center, playing key roles in Stranding Response, research, and conservation programs. Her expertise spans sea turtles and marine mammal ecology, fisheries interactions, and conservation. Sue now serves as a consultant for environmental monitoring and protection of marine species. Since July of 2022, Sue has been a Sea Turtle Committee Lead for the RWSC. With that, I will turn it over to Sue.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I appreciate everyone joining us today. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an introduction into sea turtle research planning in support of impact assessment for U.S. Atlantic offshore wind, which I'll be referring to as OSW. So today I'm going to give you a little bit of background about sea turtles in general, about RWSC, and then move into challenges and concerns that we face in trying to determine impacts of offshore wind on sea turtles. I'm going to talk to you about the new RWSC science plan, and then tell you how we plan to take a big chunk and move forward with all of the work that needs to be done. So to start off, RWSC is the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative for Offshore Wind. This group was cooperatively established in July of 2021, and the mission is relatively long but pretty precise. I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. The mission of RWSC is to collaboratively and effectively conduct and coordinate relevant, credible, and efficient regional monitoring and research of wildlife and marine ecosystems that supports the advancement of environmentally responsible and cost-efficient offshore wind power development activities in U.S. Atlantic waters. I think everyone is aware of the fact that the development of offshore wind has moved very quickly in the past decade or so in the Atlantic, and that to some degree the environmental monitoring and research has not moved quite as quickly. And I believe RWSC was really formed to address this discrepancy and try to move forward, again, as efficiently and appropriately as possible with monitoring of this renewable resource. So the RWSC consists of 4 different sectors that collaboratively came together to form the group and serve collectively on the steering committee and other committees, the subcommittees. These include members of the offshore wind industry, federal agencies, states, and environmental non-governmental organizations. And there are a number of experts and academics that are involved as well to sort of help move the science and research forward. RWSC has a number of taxa or habitat-based subcommittees. These include committees dedicated to studying marine mammals, birds and bats, protected fishes, sea turtles, and in general, the habitat and ecosystem surrounding wind development. I am the Sea Turtle Lead, so I've been working with the subcommittee since its inception. And as a group, the Sea Turtle Subcommittee has chosen to focus on 4 of the 5 sea turtle species that exist in U.S. Atlantic waters. These include the leatherback, loggerhead, green, and Kemp's Ridley turtles. We chose not to focus on the hawksbill turtle because its distribution is in the extreme southeast part of the country, and there are not high enough numbers to really do effective research and monitoring on that species. The RWSC study area includes pretty much the entire U.S. Atlantic coast. It's divided into 5 subregions, which include from north to south, the Gulf of Maine, southern New England, where an awful lot of activity is happening right now, the New York, New Jersey Bight, the U.S. Central Atlantic, and the U.S. Southeast Atlantic. Most of the lease and construction and approval has happened north of the Southeast region. So that's where a lot of our focus has taken place thus far. That doesn't mean that the Southeast Atlantic is not an important area for sea turtles particularly, just that we've kind of started in the areas where most of the offshore wind development is occurring right now. The 2 areas, number 3 and 4, the New York, New Jersey Bight and U.S. Central Atlantic, is kind of the area that Barco is most interested in. So you'll see a lot of my talk focused on this area. So now I'll start off with a little bit of background about the research on impacts of offshore wind regarding sea turtles. It'll be a very brief discussion because there isn't much. This is a picture of sort of the North Atlantic. Most of the work on marine species and impacts of offshore wind has been done in the North Sea. And there are not many turtles there. So the work has focused on marine mammals, on fishes, benthic invertebrates, and the ecosystem in general. There's been a fair amount of bird and bat research that's been conducted, a little bit in the North Sea, but also a lot from terrestrial wind farms. And unfortunately, not many sea turtles are found on land either. So when you look up research on impacts of offshore wind and sea turtles, you get a lot of theoretical what if type publications, but really very little has been done that has been directed directly at what impacts offshore wind has to sea turtles. So that was brief. Now, what do we do about that? Well, we've identified some challenges and concerns concerning studying impacts of offshore wind on sea turtles, and I'll go over those briefly and then tell you what kind of recommendations we've made based on those. Some of the concerns that we've identified on the Sea Turtle Subcommittee are that sea turtles are very likely the most abundant species covered by the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, to be impacted in the U.S. Atlantic waters. Although all 4 of the species that I discussed are covered by the ESA, there are still a lot of individual turtles out there, and they are distributed throughout all of the wind lease areas as far as we know. Maybe not every species in every area in every season, but certainly there are sea turtles out there in those areas. To date, although there have been a few projects that have been approved and some that are currently under construction, there has been no required mitigation for sea turtles that has been part of the record of decision or the environmental impact statements to date. That doesn't mean that monitoring isn't required. Certainly monitoring is required for all species, but most of the actual mitigation involved has been directed towards birds, bats, and for marine species, the North Atlantic right whale. There are a number of restrictions that are being put in place to avoid interacting with right whales, and these are mostly seasonal. In the northern part of the range, these occur in the summertime, which is also the time when sea turtles are occurring in those areas. However, in the New York Bight and in the Central Atlantic area, the seasonal restrictions for right whales will not necessarily coincide with the times when sea turtles are most abundant. So any protections that might have occurred because construction or noise or other activities are limited will not necessarily benefit sea turtles like they will in other areas. Some challenges that we've identified in studying impacts of offshore wind on sea turtles are that, as I said before, there's little previous research. So Although there is previous research for some of the other species, certainly what happens on land or what happens in the North Sea, for example, is not necessarily what's going to happen off the US coast, but at least there is some idea of what has happened, and we can develop some general hypotheses about what might happen based on this research from other areas. We don't really have that for sea turtles. So we are really starting from ground zero. There are also limited baseline data for sea turtles that can be used to study impacts, and I'll get into that quite a bit more in a few minutes. And then there's climate change. Climate change is affecting sea turtles, will continue to affect sea turtles. We don't know exactly how, we don't know to what extent, and this is very likely going to compound any impact assessment that we conduct specific to sea turtles. So let's get back to this idea of limited baseline data. Baseline data can come in a number of forms. Generally, it's information about the biology, ecology, abundance of animals that can be used to compare either between different areas or before and after something occurs. And most people think of baseline data as numbers data. How many animals are there in an area, and are there the same number before or after, or in this place versus that place? Sounds fairly simple. Well, it's not quite so simple, and I'll get to that in a minute too. Other types of baseline data include distribution. So are the animals in this area, and when are they in this area? And when we have whatever is going to impact the area, does that number change, or do the amount of turtles change? And this is a map of essentially the Mid-Atlantic and New York Bight area, Central Atlantic and New York Bight, showing all the wind lease areas and then the proposed areas in this bright green color. And it would be great to know that in this little spot right here, we regularly see sea turtles of this species at this time. But we really don't have that information, particularly for some of the less common species, such as the Kemp's Wrigley, which is critically endangered, and the green turtle. All sea turtles in this region are seasonally present in one area or another. They don't spend their entire year off this part of the coast, so they move. The timing of their movement, where they move, how quickly they move, that is all information that could be considered baseline data if we actually had those data. We have some ideas, but not necessarily at the scale and the precision and accuracy that you might need. Behavior can be used for baseline data. Things like how much time does an animal spend foraging, and what percent of time does it spend at the surface, when and where does it breed and nest, and that sort of thing. Again, great things to have for a species for baseline data. Same with physiology, vital rates, heart rate, respiration rate, stress hormone levels, etc. But these two variables are interesting because for sea turtles, which are cold-blooded species, they very much change with the outside environment. So whereas a mammal or a bird, both warm-blooded species, they may be able to conduct foraging behavior, for example, in the same way, regardless of the outside, of variations in outside environmental conditions, sea turtles don't function that way. When it's colder, they move more slowly. They may forage differently. They may not dive as deeply because water temperature might be considerably cooler at depth. They may not be able to dive as long. So again, these typical baseline data that might be used are a little bit more challenging for sea turtles. But let's get back to this first one, abundance and density. It just seems like it would be so easy. Estimating abundance of sea turtles is not quite as easy, or of any marine species is not quite as easy as you think it would be. The methodology most commonly used these days is something called line transect distance sampling. Generally, a platform such as an airplane or a vessel is used, and that vessel or airplane moves along set transects, either in a random manner or in a systematic manner, but the transects are set. They know where they're going before they go out there. And this map in the corner here is one of a set of track lines that was used for a study I was responsible for at the Virginia Aquarium. So we randomly chose an area that we wanted to survey, and then we randomly chose the beginning track line and then flew every 4 track lines or something like that for each survey. And when the survey is occurring, there's a known altitude if you're using a plane, and it follows this line, which is the red dotted line. And when the observers spot a turtle, they use some instrumentation to determine an angle, and then there's geometry, and basically you get a distance from the track line for each turtle seen. And when you're studying turtles, you have to actually see them, but they don't spend all their time at the surface. I mean, if we could go out and say, hey guys, we're doing a survey, everybody come to the surface to be counted, like in this picture, it'd be easy, right? But yeah, that doesn't happen. So you're out there, and any one time there are, oops, let's go forward here. There are turtles distributed throughout the water column. You have a plane, and that plane flies across the water, and the observers look for turtles, and lo and behold, they might see 2 turtles at the surface. But in actuality, there are 6 turtles in the area. Abundance surveys that we have are pretty accurate about what turtles were at the surface. But some turtles, particularly very small ones, get missed. And all of the turtles that are below the surface at any depth get missed. And so while we may have a very accurate abundance estimate, that estimate has to be corrected for things that we don't have good measurements of. So surface time, how much time does a turtle spend at the surface? For a marine mammal in general, this estimation is not super complicated. It may vary based on location or based on age class or whatever, but in general, it's a pretty tight amount of time. And marine mammals tend to be present in groups, so very large groups of animals. There may never be the entire group below the surface, or they may not be below the surface for very long. Sea turtles spend most of their time below the surface, and most of the time they are spotted in 1s and 2s. So they're harder to see. And they don't necessarily spend the same amount of time at the surface all year long or in every different habitat. So in Virginia, when I studied surface time, I found that loggerhead turtles might spend 50% or more of their time at the surface in relatively deep water in the spring when water is the coolest, when they're first moving into the area. But in the fall, particularly in shallow water, they may only spend 15% of their time at the surface. So 100 turtles counted on a survey in the spring results in a very different total abundance than 100 turtles counted in the fall. And understanding this relationship of turtles at the surface to turtles that are actually counted is problematic for turtles. So that's why abundance is kind of a difficult baseline measure to use. Long-winded explanation, but in general, it's a challenge. So let's get back to other challenges. What about climate change? We know climate change is happening, and we very much believe that it's going to be a compounding set of variables whenever we try to determine impacts. There's been an awful lot written about the possible effects of climate change on sea turtles. When we distill it down, there are 3 major categories of effects that are associated with increasing ocean temperature, rising sea level, and this variability and intensity of weather events. So we know that increasing temperature will very likely change the distribution of sea turtles, probably all life stages, although we may not know how that may differ depending on the size, the age, and the behavior of the turtle. Some of this is already being seen in stranding data and other data. We certainly believe that there will be changes in timing of migration and nesting. And again, that's already being seen in some areas with some populations. Sea turtles have temperature-dependent sex determination. When their eggs are being incubated, they could be male or female, and the temperature at which they're incubated will determine that. Higher temperatures produce more females. So we are potentially looking at increasing percentages of females, which may or may not be a bad thing, but how that affects the population is at this point unknown. And then obviously there are indirect changes to prey distribution, prey numbers, and obviously sea turtle foraging that may be coming along. Again, we don't understand completely what those changes are yet, and we don't want to associate changes that are associated with climate change and assign them to changes that are caused by offshore wind development. Certainly increasing sea level will be, over the long term, very likely decreasing nesting and hatching success for turtles. And this increased variability in the weather seems to be confounding animals, causing more cold stunning events in a lot of areas. This is very likely increasing stress of individuals and the spread of disease and parasites and things like that. So things are happening to sea turtles associated with climate change, and we need to understand those better to be able to tease those effects out when we look at offshore wind impacts. Let's change directions just briefly and talk a little bit about environmental impact assessment. How do you assess whether there is an impact or not? Kind of traditionally, the most common design for these types of studies is called a BACI design. That's essentially before-after control impact. You have a space where there's going to be an impact, and then you find another space that is identical to that where there's not going to be an impact, and you compare things that happen before and after the impact occurs. Really simple, works wonderfully when you can identify appropriate control areas. Now, the marine environment is pretty challenging for that. How do we know that a control area is truly identical to an impact area? How do we know how far the impact is going to affect from, for example, say a pile driving site or something like that? If not done well, these types of experiments can result in inappropriate conclusions, and we don't want that. So when we do get to impact studies, we are very likely going to be using something called a phase gradient experimental design. A little sciencey, but essentially you look at an area where a wind farm is going to be developed, and then you study that area, and then you move away from that area and look at gradients in various baseline parameters that you've chosen. And then you study it long enough in different phases to tell whether those gradients change between the different phases or among the different phases, depending on how many you have. This relies very heavily on having good baseline data measurements that you can collect throughout the time period, both before, during, and after whatever phases you identify. And it's important that your baseline parameters that you choose are ecologically important parameters. Do we know that, for example, measuring sea turtle respiration rate and noticing changes in respiration rate is ecologically important for an individual or a population? And so this is a much more powerful experimental tool design, but it still relies on some sort of baseline data. So challenges and concerns, things that we need to think about before we actually lay out a plan to study impacts of offshore wind on various animal groups. So let's get to the science plan. Within the science plan, there are a number of chapters. There's a sea turtle chapter, which is pretty specific to recommendations that the Sea Turtle Subcommittee has made. And then there's an appendix that goes a little bit more deeply into reasons why sea turtles are challenging, things that we need to consider for sea turtles that maybe we don't need to consider for other animal groups. And that's much longer and much more detailed. The science plan itself, again, was a multi-sector, broad-based effort. The different various groups that are involved in the RWSC, and you see Barco right up here at the top, along with NROC. It's essentially sister agency to the north. BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and NOAA are also really big players in RWSC, but there are an awful lot of groups that have contributed to this effort. The science plan was developed primarily over the past year or so, and it's supported both in kind and with direct contributions from these groups and many others. So it's been a huge collaborative effort. Specifically, the Sea Turtle content contributors include the 30-odd people who are official Sea Turtle Subcommittee members, but we are open to the public and have received a lot of really good recommendations from folks that are just interested in sea turtle science and studying sea turtles and offshore wind. The RWSC staff and all of the other subcommittee leads, contractors, and everything also contributed to the development of all of the chapters. But we all learned from each other and really really benefited from talking about what our challenges were. We also have talked with a number of outside experts and obviously relied very heavily on the literature that's out there. The development process, as I said, has really taken place over the last year or so. The first Sea Turtle Subcommittee meeting was in July of 2022. We submitted collaboratively the entire draft plan in June of 2023. There was a 3-month review period, and then a revision period where a lot of us, particularly the staff, did a lot of work to take into account all of the recommendations that we got. Then it has been reviewed again by all of the various sectors. And in fact, the science plan was released on January 25th. And there is a launch webinar on Friday. So if you're interested in that, there's some information at the end about attending that launch webinar. The science plan itself is really web-based. You can download a hard copy of it, but we wanted to design it to be a living document. So it will be continually updated and version controlled. There'll be mechanisms for for presenting updates or corrections. There are 11 chapters, and the Sea Turtle chapter is number 6. There are also a number of appendices, again, with much more detailed information that kind of explains where the recommendations that we make came from. So overall, for all of the groups that are represented in the science plan, there are some key findings. Not surprisingly, baseline data are needed for every species. But sea turtles are one of the species groups that it is especially poor. So no surprise there. Another thing that the science plan identifies is that there is a real need for some very high altitude vision, coordination, collaboration, and facilitation in order to answer big questions about impacts of offshore wind. And RWSC may be a really good group to do some of this coordination and facilitation. So 3 of the areas that were identified as needing for research assistance are areas that include tagging, acoustic, and visual surveys of marine mammals and sea turtles. Specifically, there are other specific needs for birds and bats. A real look into the use of high definition aerial photography and videography for multiple species groups. There is the ability to collect a lot of information using often unmanned systems, but also manned systems that collect a lot of information, but we don't necessarily have the ability to analyze that easily. And for manned systems, that requires then observers spending time on a vessel in a plane, and then going back and looking at all of that video and or photography. And so developing artificial intelligence and algorithms to identify various things that are seen in this photography and these images is incredibly important, and probably lagging a little bit more than most people think it is as far as the sophistication of it. There's also a need for data management on a very high level, but particularly for telemetry data. And this is really with most species, but there's a lot of data out there that has been a part of smaller projects, very focused projects, but those data may be able to be used collaboratively to look at large scale regional questions, but we need to find a way to collect them and analyze them in an appropriate manner. And then there are a number of technologies that are identified as really being needed to improve our ability to assess impact of offshore wind. So because there wasn't any research, published research on impacts to turtles, the subcommittee had to really come up with what we thought were the most likely impacts that turtles might face. And I want to really stress here that impact itself is not a negative term. Impacts may be negative or positive, and determining which is actually a pretty important thing. But the 4 areas that the Sea Turtle Subcommittee identified were vessel strikes. We know turtles are susceptible to vessel strikes. We know that there's going to be a lot of additional vessel traffic associated with development of offshore wind, as there would be with development of any offshore infrastructure, and that could be a problem for animals. We also recognize that because of construction and or operation, turtles may be displaced from areas where wind is developed. Likewise, they may be attracted, particularly once the structure is in place and biofouling occurs. This is called a reef effect. And there may be more turtles in wind farms once they are developed than there were in those areas prior to development. We also recognize that there are going to be changes in fishing, in fish distribution, in other sea turtle prey distribution, and in the ecosystem in general. Is it possible that there will be thermocline changes surrounding a relatively large wind farm? Are currents going to change? We don't know, and we don't know whether these will affect animals. We also recognize, knowing what we know about turtles, that these impacts will very likely vary by species, by the life stage of each species, by the behavioral state that turtles are in when they're in the area surrounding wind farms, by season, and by habitat. Are we looking at a sandy bottom, at a hard bottom, at soft corals, or whatever? And where the wind farms are developed may very well determine a scope or an intensity of impacts. So regarding sea turtles in general, there are some very specific recommendations, and some of them are very broad scale, but they are somewhat specific. Each of the chapters really had three primary sections: one on data collection, another on data analysis, and a third on data management. And while I want to recognize that data management is incredibly important and is desperately needed in many cases, including with sea turtle data, it's not very sexy and it's not very interesting to talk about, so you can read that part on your own. I'm just including here the basic general topics included in the data collection and analysis sections. And again, these are very broad topics under which there are numerous recommendations. So in general, for data collection and analysis, we need to determine where new data collection is needed. We need to figure out what those baseline parameters for sea turtles should be, how they might be most effective, how they are appropriately and consistently measured, and how they can best be used to address impact of offshore wind. At the same time, we need to determine and characterize oceanographic and habitat drivers of these various parameters, including distribution, abundance, and behavior, so that we can then tease out the effects of climate change and the effects of changing season and that sort of thing from any effects that might be associated with wind itself, or development of structures and operation of these wind farms. And then finally, we need to determine if we do find impacts, whether those impacts are negative or positive. Are they ecologically important? Is, for example, temporary displacement from an area during destruction, is that going to affect an individual or a population in a significant manner? So these are pretty broad, but like I said, there are some very more specific recommendations under each of these sort of general topic areas. As I mentioned earlier, we identified some technology needs. We certainly need to develop and test smaller satellite tags, particularly those with depth sensors, so that we understand that relationship of turtle surface time to turtle underwater time, and understand time spent foraging versus time spent migrating or resting at the surface, whatever. Some of those tags don't fit little turtles very well or for very long, and so that technology needs to be advanced as quickly as possible. We need to look at improving the drag or reducing the drag for those attachments so that A, they can stay on for longer, and B, they can inhibit the turtles as little as possible. Turtles are hard to catch and put tags on. So are there pie in the sky, ideas for remotely attaching tags on a fairly permanent manner? Can we put a tag on an autonomous vehicle and go run over and slap it on a turtle in the water and have it stay on? Might be kind of out of the box, but if we can develop it, then it would really help a lot. Then there's also a couple of techniques, one in particular being environmental DNA or eDNA, that is really being touted as a new technology that can help us answer a lot of questions, but in fact, we have no idea how those questions will be answered quite yet. So there needs to be quite a bit of work done on eDNA and whether that tool can really help answer some of the questions that we're hoping to be able to answer when we study impact of offshore wind. Finally, one of the last topics that I spelled out here is really understanding the use of acoustic telemetry with turtles. Acoustic telemetry involves tags that emit a particular signal that can be picked up by receivers. These tags are used fairly heavily in fish and shark research, but also with invertebrates, and they are being used quite a bit in offshore wind studies. But there are a lot of new receivers being deployed, but not quite as many tags necessarily planned to be deployed on sea turtles. But with this technology really being used a lot, should we and can we use it more for sea turtles than we are currently? So that's a big question that we have. So lots of recommendations. Where do we start? How do we get going? So we're also moving forward with a work plan. We're going to kind of take everything small bite by small bite and say, okay, what can we do now with very little funding to get ready for the next steps? And I've kind of already said this, we need to identify those baseline measurements that we can use and then start collecting those data. We need to make sure that when we collect data, we can manage it in an appropriate manner. And then we're really going to focus this year on looking at acoustic telemetry for sea turtles and whether we should be investing a lot more energy into that particular research tool. And in fact, we have a kind of a kickoff workshop on February 15th that is open to the public that you can find on the RWSC website. So if you'd like to know more, check out the website, rwsc.org. There is an events calendar. You can sign up for the science plan release webinar, the acoustic telemetry workshop, or any of the subcommittee meetings. And if you're interested in what happened and how we got to where we are, there are archival materials available. You can look at meeting recordings, past agendas and presentations, etc. So I hope this has sparked your interest a little bit in how we're going to go about making sure that sea turtles are appropriately studied, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Sue. I learned so much from you, as I always do. Whenever you talk about turtles, I realize how much I don't know. I'm sure folks have questions, and I would encourage people to put their questions in the chat. And please don't be worried about asking a silly or stupid question, because there won't be any. Sue did a great job of not using jargon, but there might be something that you didn't quite understand, or maybe you have questions about the overall background that she presented, the specific sea turtle challenges, the challenges around seeing them and surveying them, and really the whole RWSC enterprise, which is pretty exciting, and their next step. So enough from me, and I'm going to start looking at the chat and trying to organize and pose your questions for you. We do have a first question that has come in from Heather Genovich. I'm sorry if I pronounced the last name wrong. It says, are eDNA primers available for the less studied sea turtle species?
I believe they're being developed. There are a couple of groups. I know the Coonamessett Farm Foundation is one of them that have received some funding to make sure that there are primers being developed. And so I think for the most part, the 4 species at least that we are most concerned with will have or already have primers available. It's more in interpretation of the data. Can we develop an index that says something about if there's this much DNA, that means there are this many turtles? Right now, we realize we can use eDNA to say, yes, we see the presence of this particular species. If we don't see any eDNA from a particular species, does that mean there aren't any there, or does that mean we just didn't get any of that DNA? If we see a whole lot of DNA from one particular species, does that mean there are a whole lot of that particular species, or does that mean that there's one turtle that's just shedding a lot of DNA in the area. So the concern is not so much the primer, because that's relatively well figured out. It's interpreting the data that is challenging.
That's super interesting. And I'm going to hold my follow-up question because we have a new question coming in. The question from Tara Haight is, are you in collaboration with other research organizations to help fill in those gaps in terms of species behavior and such? She adds, when I was a researcher at Shark Life Conservation Group in South Africa, we studied green sea turtles and hawksbills, and I'm sure they'd be glad to share their research with you.
The Sea Turtle Subcommittee is a pretty varied group. We are fairly U.S. centric, but many of our members work internationally, and we've certainly been looking at the international literature, and so yes, I feel like we do have a pretty broad cast of where we are looking and who we're consulting with. But we certainly welcome any and all efforts that we can use to help do this. One of the issues is a lot of the work on sea turtles has been done in very specific habitats, and sea turtles do behave differently in different areas. And so a lot of what we need to do is figure out for our baseline parameters what's going on in the vicinity of the area where wind farms are being developed, and how do those parameters relate to that specific area, season, depth, habitat profile, et cetera.
I'm going to ask a question that I hope is not mean. I don't think it is. I'm just curious, like the big picture, if we know it, just sort of on the population status and trends of some of the key species that we encounter on the Atlantic coast. Like, how's recovery going? Do we know do we know what the trends are? Do we have that kind of baseline? Is that sufficient?
We have different measures of trends in abundance, and how accurate they are is a little bit questionable. So, for example, there's most of the work that has really long-term trends associated with it is on nesting beaches, and some nesting beaches for some species are showing an increase. Some are relatively level, and some are decreasing. But understanding the context of that and how it relates to what's happening in water is not always clear. So when you look at, for example, hatching success, and you've had a really good hatching year, there may be a 30-year lag period, for example, for loggerheads, before those animals are, actually in the water and being observed as juveniles or subadults or nesting females. And increasing numbers of, for example, green turtles nesting in the US, which is happening in Florida, is there a corresponding decrease in maybe the more southern distribution of the species that is outside the US? Or is this really a population increase? So are we looking at shifting scales, or are we looking at changes in abundance? And so understanding those trends is still a little bit challenging.
Thank you for a really thoughtful answer to that. And there was a question that came in asking about the citations for the phase gradient approach, and another participant had screenshotted that and put the references to the phase gradient approach in the chat. I think that they're likely also in the full text of the RWSC science plan.
They are. You can find the full citation in the science plan, yes.
If someone from staff at your leisure could put the link, I believe it was in the announcement for the webinar to the plan, but that would be helpful to put that in the.
Yeah, and if not, I can look it up and pass it on.
Mm-hmm. And there is another question. Before that, I want to just quickly cover something that I was supposed to before I introduced the question period, which is just reminding folks that there will be an email sent out that has a link to this recording, and also a link to a survey. We're interested in future offshore conservation working group webinars, and the survey is to get your input on that. And that survey link will also be posted into this chat at the end of this call. There was another question asking from someone who acknowledges they may have missed this, but what can we learn from interactions with offshore wind farms and turtles in other locations Europe and or Asia. And you did mention there just aren't a lot of turtles in the North Sea, but can you riff a little bit more on, surely we must have learned something from somewhere about this.
The work that I've done, the looking that I've done, is that there's not a lot of sea turtle directed research. Some of the Asian work, again, I don't know how new those developments are, and it does not appear that there's a whole lot of sea turtle specific impact work that's been done, even in areas where sea turtles are pretty prominent. Most of the research has come from the North Sea, particularly the marine mammals, some of the fish and invertebrate research, and that's where most of the European wind farms are. And there are not a lot of sea turtles in the North Sea.
Yeah. You focused a little bit on climate impacts at the beginning of the presentation, and well, with fish and many fish species, we're observing that the centers of distribution of the populations shifting on average towards the poles, and I think there's some suggestion that sea turtles may be nesting along the Atlantic coast more at further north than they used to in the past. I don't know if that's exactly true. I'm curious about that. And also, I know that in the past when I got kind of excited about, adaptation and continued sea turtle reproduction in the face of climate change, people like you explained to me it's way more complicated than that, Jay. And just because you have a nesting beach somewhere in a new place doesn't mean those turtles are going to make a significant contribution to the population.
Yeah, it seems like from a nesting perspective, turtles are using a couple of different strategies. They may be broadening the areas where they nest. Again, the older females, the ones that have nested for a long time, seem to be more likely to stay in the same area, but the timing of when they are laying their nest might be changing. So for example, the Archie Carr Refuge, I believe that loggerheads are nesting is starting earlier. It kind of maybe slacks off a little bit during the heat of the summer, but then it extends longer into the fall. So the turtles may be nesting in a similar area, but they are changing the timing of when they are laying their nests. But there also seems to be some evidence of expansion of some species as well. So I think there is a combination of strategies that's happening, and hopefully they are adaptable enough to deal with the issues that we're seeing. Certainly, the in-water distribution seems to be both moving into higher latitudes, and the timing is changing. So just in Virginia alone, my work at the aquarium, we are certainly regularly seeing live sea turtles in the area in April, whereas 2 decades ago, rarely saw them before mid to late May. And same with those animals that occur in the fall. The peak time of stranding and the length of number of days into the fall and even into the next year that we see sea turtle stranding is extended.
Thank you so much. That's so interesting. We have a question from a VIP audience member, Laura McKay, past founding member of Barco and past co-chair of the Offshore Conservation Working Group, asks, how are the prospects for funding all this needed research? Any good prospects on the horizon?
Personally, I'm not aware of all of the funding resources, and that's certainly one of the things that RWSC, not me specifically, but the group is working on, is making sure that the funding that is available is put to the most efficient and best uses that it can be. And so there is funding out there. A number of the states have power sharing agreements with companies that have developed leases and are planning developments. Virginia is not one of them, unfortunately, which is where I am, because of our infrastructure. Energy infrastructure is quite different. But there is also support from BOEM, from NOAA Fisheries, Fish and Wildlife Service. So there is money out there. And I think the important thing is to make sure that it's being spent appropriately and efficiently, and that if we're asking one question about one species group, that we try to ask it about another species group at the same time, and answer as many questions over as many scales as we can simultaneously. And so, I do think there's good opportunity for some funding out there, and hopefully we can coordinate it so that we're getting the biggest bang for our buck.
Yeah, great. And my sort of shoot from the hip sense is that there is more money now available for this kind of work, more money flowing than there has been for quite a while, and it's likely not nearly enough.
Which is always the case
Yeah.
for environmental work.
I
So,
appreciate.
making the best use of the funds that are out there is I think really one of the goals, and one of the things that RWSC is going to really be able to help with. And that's, looking at large scale collaborative research for a number of species in a number of areas is I think one of the key things that hopefully this group can help coordinate, and bringing lots of independent researchers and research projects together, and really facilitating our ability to work collectively and collaboratively to answer big environmental questions is important. The U.S. Atlantic Ocean is big. Turtles are spread across a huge area, as are marine mammals, birds, bats, and fishes. And so we can't just look at one little bit of the ocean and figure out what's going on. We need to have a very multifaceted approach to answering these questions. And this group, I think, is one group that's really bringing that need to the forefront and hopefully participating in making it happen.
That's really great. One thing that I thought I might take advantage of having the microphone just to remind folks that that Barco is very tightly linked with RWSC and supports, there's a lot of dynamic exchange between Barco and RWSC. It's really exciting to see RWSC really take off, and to see the words efficiency, really looking to how to do this efficiently, and how to really, bring together a lot of different researchers who may not have worked together before. It's very exciting. I part of the form that the collaboration with Barco takes is working on to bring the information that's produced, the spatial data, the maps, to the public, to decision-making forums through the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal. And Carl Villikova, who leads that portal team, is on this call. And if you explore the portal a little bit, you can learn even more about sea turtles, and some of the things that Sue's talking about might kind of click a bit. We do now have monthly sliders, so you can look at the distribution of various species and how it changes over the season. And we have some pretty brand new data that has been worked up that shows the locations of strandings of turtles over time, and those are interesting data as well. I just wanted to mention that's part of how we take this information and move it into various decision making fora. Questions are slowing down a little bit, but we still have a few more minutes if folks would like to, before I'll ask Kevin to give us some concluding remarks. And thank you, Carl, for putting the link to the portal data I mentioned into the chat. Well, thank you so much, Sue, and I will relinquish the podium back to Kevin now to close us out. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you all.
Thanks, Jay and Sue. I'll echo what Jay said earlier. Every time we have you to a presentation, we learn so much, and it's a fascinating topic. So it's always a challenge to see how much more we have to do, but I think it's heartening to see that we have a really good, excellent plan in place, and a lot of folks that are collaborating to answer those questions that we need to do. So I just want to say thank you all for joining us for this webinar. I hope you add to your appreciation of all these wonderful species and the ongoing efforts related to conservation in the ocean environment. We look forward to providing more of these types of webinars for everyone. So please take an opportunity to fill out that survey that was in there. And we hope to see you all soon. Thanks again for everything.